Unit 2, Assessment Strategies, Methods, and Tools. 2.1, Introduction. In the previous unit you have been introduced with the major concepts of educational assessment and evaluation. You also learned about the purposes and principles of assessment. In this unit you will learn about the nature, strengths, and weaknesses of the various assessment strategies, methods and tools that can be used in the context of secondary education. You will also learn about planning, construction, and administration of classroom tests. Learning outcomes. At the end of this unit you should be able to identify relevant assessment strategies, methods and tools. Compare assessment and evaluation methods and tools to select appropriate ones. Develop formative and summative assessment tools as per the principles of assessment. Complete tasks on linking formative with summative assessment. Evaluate assessment tools by identifying relevant criteria. 2.2. Types and approaches to assessment. There are different approaches in conducting assessment in the classroom. Here we are going to see 5 pairs of assessment typologies, namely formal versus informal, criterion-referenced versus norm-referenced, formative versus summative assessments, divergent versus convergent, process versus product assessment. 2.2.1 Formative versus summative assessments. Assessment procedures can be classified according to their functional role during classroom instruction. One such classification system follows a sequence in which assessment procedures are likely to be used in the classroom. The most commonly referred to and used categories in this regard are formative assessment and summative assessment. Can you differentiate these concepts? Please try to describe them before you proceed studying the following section. Formative assessment. Formative assessments are used to shape and guide classroom instruction. They can include both informal and formal assessments, which will be discussed later in this section, and help us to gain a clearer picture of where our students are and what they still need help with. They can be given before, during, and even after instruction, as long as the goal is to improve instruction. Formative assessments are ongoing assessments, reviews, and observations in a classroom. They are designed to assist the learning process by providing feedback to both students and teachers. Students receive feedback that they can use to adjust, improve their performance or other aspects of their engagement in the unit, such as study techniques. For example, a language teacher may give comments on short stories composed by his or her students, but not overall marks. Teachers receive feedback on the quality of learners' understandings and consequently can modify their teaching approaches to provide enrichment or remedial activities to more effectively guide learners. For example, if a teacher observes that some students do not grasp a concept, he or she can design a review activity to reinforce the concept or use a different instructional strategy to reteach it. Teachers can conduct formative assessment at any point in a unit of study. Formative assessment is also known by the name assessment for learning. The basic idea of this concept is that the basic purpose of assessment should be to enhance students' learning. There is still another name which is associated with the concept of formative assessment: continuous assessment. Continuous assessment, as opposed to terminal assessment, is based on the premise that if assessment is to help students' improvement in their learning, and if a teacher is to determine the progress of students towards the achievement of the learning goals, it has to be conducted on a continuous basis. Thus, continuous assessment is a teaching approach as well as a process of deciding to what extent the educational objectives are actually being realized during instruction. The main advantage of continuous assessment are that both students and teachers obtain feedback from the process, which can then be used to improve the process of learning and teaching, and the final result is based on evidence gathered over the span of the learning period. In schools, continuous assessment of learning is usually carried out by teachers on the basis of impressions gained as they observe their students at work, or by various kinds of tests given periodically. Therefore, each decision is based on various types of information that are determined through different assessment methods at different times by teachers. In order to assess your students' understanding, there are various strategies that you can use. Can you mention some of the strategies that you can use to assess your students for formative purposes? Please try to mention as many strategies as you can. The following are some of the strategies of assessment you can employ in your classrooms, namely, you can make your students write their understanding of vocabulary or concepts before and after instruction. Ask students to summarize the main ideas they've taken away from your presentation, discussion, or assigned reading. Make students complete a few problems or questions at the end of instruction and check answers. Interview students individually or in groups about their thinking as they solve problems. Assign brief in-class writing assignments, e.g., why is this person or event representative of this time period in history? Tests and homework can also be used formatively if teachers analyze where students are in their learning and provide specific, focused feedback regarding performance and ways to improve it. Summative assessment. Summative assessment typically comes at the end of a course or unit of instruction. It evaluates the quality of students' learning and assigns a mark to that student's work based on how effectively learners have addressed the performance standards and criteria. Assessment tasks conducted during the progress of a semester may be regarded as summative in nature if they only contribute to the final grades of the students. The techniques used in summative assessment are determined by the instructional goals. Typically, however, they include teacher-made achievement tests, ratings of various types of performance, and assessment of products, reports, drawings, etc. The difference between formative and summative assessment can be summarized as follows. Timing. Formative assessment conducted throughout the teaching-learning process. Summative assessment conducted at the end of a teaching-learning phases, e.g. end of semester or year. Method. Formative assessment, paper and pencil tests, observations, quizzes, exercises, practical sessions administered to the group and individually. Summative assessment, paper and pencil tests, Oral tests administered to the group. Aim: formative assessment, to assess progress and recommend remedial action for non-achievement of objectives. Formative assessment, remediation, or enrichment or reteach the topic. Summative assessment, grading to determine if the program was successful. Summative assessment, to certify students and improve the curriculum. Example: formative assessment, quizzes, essays, diagnostic tests, lab reports and anecdotal records. Summative assessment, final exams, national examinations, qualifying tests. A particular assessment task can be both formative and summative. For example, students could complete Unit 1 of their module and complete an assessment task for which they earned a mark that counted towards their final grade. In this sense, the task is summative. They could also receive extensive feedback on their work. Such feedback would guide learners to achieve higher levels of performance in subsequent tasks. In this sense, the task is formative because it helps students form different approaches and strategies to improve their performance in the future. 2.2.2 Formal versus informal assessment. Assessment can also be either formal or informal. Let us try to understand their differences in the paragraphs that follow. Formal assessment. Formal assessments are where the students are aware that the task they are doing is for assessment purposes. They are frequently used in summative assessments. This usually implies a written document, such as a test, quiz, or paper. A formal assessment is given a numerical score, or grade based on student performance. We will deal more on formal assessment strategies, particularly on tests in the later section. Informal assessment, informal, is used here to indicate techniques that can easily be incorporated into classroom routines and learning activities. Informal assessment techniques can be used at any time without interfering with instructional time. Their results are indicative of the student's performance on the skill or subject of interest. Thus, they are more frequently used in formative assessments. Can you think of the informal assessment strategies that you can use in your classes? What informal assessment strategies have your teachers used when you were a student? An informal assessment usually occurs in a more casual manner and may include observation, inventories, checklists, rating scales, rubrics, performance and portfolio assessments, participation, peer and self-evaluation, and discussion. Formal tests assume a single set of expectations for all students and come with prescribed criteria for scoring and interpretation. Informal assessment, on the other hand, requires a clear understanding of the levels of ability the students bring with them. Only then may assessment activities be selected that students can attempt reasonably. Informal assessment seeks to identify the strengths and needs of individual students without regard to grade or age norms. Methods for informal assessment can be divided into two main types: unstructured, e.g., student work samples, journals, and structured, e.g., checklists, observations. The unstructured methods frequently are somewhat more difficult to score and evaluate, but they can provide a great deal of valuable information about the skills of the students. Structured methods can be reliable and valid techniques when time is spent creating the scoring procedures. Another important aspect of informal assessments is that they actively involve the students in the evaluation process. They are not just paper and pencil tests. 2.2.3 Criterion-referenced versus norm-referenced assessments. How the results of tests and other assessment procedures are interpreted also provides a method of classifying these instruments. There are two ways of interpreting student performance: criterion-referenced and norm-referenced. Criterion-referenced assessment. This type of assessment allows us to quantify the extent to which students have achieved the goals of a unit of study in a course. It is carried out against previously specified criteria and performance standards. Where a grade is assigned, it is assigned on the basis of the standard the student has achieved in each of the criteria. This type of assessment is most appropriate for quickly assessing what concepts and skills students have learned from a segment of instruction. Criterion-referenced classrooms are mastery-oriented, informing all students of the expected standard and teaching them to succeed on related outcome measures. Criterion-referenced assessments help to eliminate competition and may improve cooperation. In criterion-referenced evaluation, a student's achievement is compared against a specified criterion or standard or according to prescribed curriculum goals. If a teacher's main interest is to pinpoint how well students have mastered a particular skill, the most appropriate form of assessment may be criterion-referenced assessment. Norm-referenced assessment. This type of assessment has as its endpoint the determination of student performance based on a position within a cohort of students, the norm group. This type of assessment is most appropriate when one wishes to make comparisons across large numbers of students, or important decisions regarding student placement and advancement. For example, students' results in grade 8 national exams in our country are determined based on their relative standing in comparison to all other students who have taken the exam. Thus, when we say that a student has scored 80 percentile, it doesn't mean that the student has scored an average of 80% score. Rather, it is meant to be that the student's average score stands above 79.9% of the students, and the remaining 20% of students have scored above that particular student. Students' assignment of ranks is also another example of norm-referenced interpretation of students' performances. The focus of attention in this type of assessment is on how well the student has done on a test in comparison with other students. To summarize, the criterion-referenced assessment emphasizes description of students' performance, and the norm-referenced assessment emphasizes discrimination among individual students in terms of relative level of learning. 2.2.4 Divergent versus Convergent Assessment. Divergent assessments are those for which a range of answers or solutions might be considered correct. For example, a civics teacher might ask his or her students to compare presidential and parliamentary forms of government as preferable forms of government for a country. A student might favor a presidential form of government by providing sound arguments and valid examples. Another student also might come up with still convincing ideas favoring parliamentary form of government. In both cases, the answers are different but convincingly correct. So in divergent assessments there might not be one single answer. Divergent assessment tools include essay tests and solutions to the workout problems. A convergent assessment are those which have only one correct response that the student is trying to reach. They are generally easier to mark. They tend to be quicker to deliver and give more specific and directed feedback to individuals. It can also provide wide curriculum coverage. Objective test items are the best example and demonstrate the value of this approach in assessing knowledge. 2.2.5 Process versus product assessment. Process assessment focuses on the steps or procedures underlying a particular ability or task. This means the cognitive steps in performing a mathematical operation or the procedure involved in analyzing a blood sample. Because it provides more detailed information, process assessment is most useful when a student is learning a new skill, and for providing formative feedback to assist in improving performance. For example, a biology teacher teaching his students how to identify a microorganism using a microscope might give them a task to do an activity. Here his/focus is not only on whether students are able to identify the microorganism. He should also check on whether students have followed the proper procedures to reach the conclusion. Product assessment focuses on evaluating the result or outcome of a process. Using the above examples, we would focus on the answer to the math computation or the accuracy of the blood test results. Product assessment is most appropriate for documenting proficiency or competency in a given skill. A multiple choice test that a mathematics teacher gives to his students, for example, is a product assessment. There is no way he or she will check whether students have followed the proper procedures to get the correct answer. 2.3 Assessment strategies. Assessment strategy refers to those assessment tasks, methods, approaches, activities in which students are engaged to ensure that all the learning objectives of a subject, a unit or a lesson have been adequately addressed. Assessment strategies range from informal, almost unconscious, observation to formal examinations. Although different subject areas may have some differences on the assessment strategies they use, generally, however, there are varieties of methods that can be used by most subjects. When selecting assessment strategies in our subject areas, there are a number of things that we have to consider. First and foremost, it is important that we choose an assessment technique appropriate for the particular behavior being assessed. We have to use a strategy that can give students an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of behavior that the learning outcome demands. Assessment strategies should also be related to the course material and relevant to students' lives. Therefore, we have to provide assessment strategies that relate to students' future work. There are many different ways to categorize learning goals for students. One way in which the different learning outcomes that we want our students to develop can be categorized is presented as follows: knowledge and understanding, What facts do students know outright? What information can they retrieve? What do they understand? Reasoning proficiency. Can students analyze, categorize, and sort into component parts? Can they generalize and synthesize what they have learned? Can they evaluate and justify the worth of a process or decision? Skills. We have certain skills that we want students to master, such as reading fluently, working productively in a group, making an oral presentation, speaking a foreign language, or designing an experiment. Ability to create products. Another kind of learning target is student-created products, tangible evidence that the student has mastered knowledge, reasoning, and specific production skills. Examples include a research paper, a piece of furniture, or artwork. Dispositions. We also frequently care about student attitudes and habits of mind, including attitudes towards school, persistence, responsibility, flexibility, and desire to learn. Activity. In groups, discuss and identify the assessment strategies that you consider are best for assessing each of these categories of learning goals, and compare your work with that of other groups. From among the various assessment strategies that can be used by classroom teachers, some are described below for your consideration as student teachers. Classroom presentations. A classroom presentation is an assessment strategy that requires students to verbalize their knowledge, select and present samples of finished work, and organize their thoughts about a topic in order to present a summary of their learning. It may provide the basis for assessment upon completion of a student's project or essay. For example, students may present a report after an educational visit. What other educational activities can you imagine in your subject area, where students can present their works? Conferences. A conference is a formal or informal meeting between the teacher and a student for the purpose of exchanging information or sharing ideas. A conference might be held to explore the student's thinking and suggest next steps, assess the student's level of understanding of a particular concept or procedure, and review, clarify, and extend what the student has already completed. What advantages do you think conference as a method of assessment will have? Exhibitions or demonstrations. An exhibition/demonstration is a performance in a public setting, during which a student explains and applies a process, procedure, etc., in concrete ways to show individual achievement of specific skills and knowledge. What type of objectives do you think this assessment strategy could serve to measure? Interviews. You should be familiar with the interviews journalists conduct with different personalities. An interview can also be used for assessment purposes in educational settings. In such applications, interview is a face-to-face conversation in which teacher and student use inquiry to share their knowledge and understanding of a topic or problem. This form of assessment can be used by the teacher to explore the student's thinking, assess the student's level of understanding of a concept or procedure, and gather information, obtain clarification, determine positions, and probe for motivations. Observation. Observation is a process of systematically viewing and recording students while they work, for the purpose of making instruction decisions. Observation can take place at any time and in any setting. It provides information on students' strengths and weaknesses, learning styles, interests, and attitudes. Observations may be informal or highly structured, and incidental or scheduled over different periods of time in different learning contexts. Performance tasks. During a performance task, students create, produce, perform, or present works on real-world issues. The performance task may be used to assess a skill or proficiency, and provides useful information on the process as well as the product. Please mention some examples of performance tasks that students can do in your subject area.